Good morning, my name is Paul Baker from Glasgow Caledonian University, and this is Roger Curtis from Historic Scotland. Historic Scotland has been funding a programme of research into improving the energy efficiency of historic and traditional buildings. Could Roger explain the background to this research programme?
When we started off nearly 3 years ago now, we looked specifically at the respective building elements of a traditional building. So walls, mass walls, thermal properties of mass walls, traditional glazing, thermal properties of sash and case windows, for example, and the improvements that we could make to those windows to bring them up to modern standard. We've also looked at thermal performance of floors, timber floors and solid floors, in addition to some of the other parts like performance of traditional roofs and measures by which that could be improved. One of the main ones that we started with was the walls, both in terms of how they performed unimproved, but also the types of insulation that we could perhaps look at putting in and the results that those gave.
Roger, what do you think are the perceived or perhaps the real issues with improving the energy efficiency of traditional buildings?
I think there is quite a big problem in people thinking that they can't be improved at all. Therefore, it's all a basket case and you've got to get rid of it, as slightly argued for in the report, the 40% house, which we would seek to work quite hard against if possible. Key areas in traditional and historic buildings is how do we change the look of the building, or if we change the look, are we comfortable with that change and that look? And I think insulation being put internally and its effect on cornices and skirtings and facings, external insulation, how do you go about putting that on? And that does not always have to be a bad thing. If we remember that an awful lot of Scotland is covered in a cement render that is not performing terribly well technically anyway, if that came off and something better went on, have we lost something? Well, possibly not. It could actually be an improvement. And let's not forget the sheer cost of such retrofit measures. This is disruptive to homeowners. It is dirty and messy and can be quite expensive, and we have to remember payback times and is this value for money. So it's getting a handle on all these areas of the physical difficulty and the cost and how one looks at that over the long term. And the one thing that we have to emphasize with traditional buildings and all older buildings is they tend to last. We're in a courtyard now that was probably is at least several hundred years old, with earlier elements yet still performing very well structurally. So we can do long. We do many years of durability and service.
What are the potential risks of improving insulation in traditional buildings, and how is the research programme addressing this?
We've got to be careful in the understandable desire to improve thermal efficiency, mainly by insulation measures. We need to make sure that what we do to a building, what we apply to the building, doesn't upset the building's ability to disperse moisture. Crudely, that's referred to as breathing, essentially, but what we want to make sure is that moisture disperses, particularly in mass walls, disperses properly, and also that the occupant's health is not affected. And we are also conscious of restricting airflow to ensure that there is a healthy internal environment. Excessive humidity behind insulation board can lead to timber decay and loss of thermal performance of the mass wall element itself, which, if it is dry and good condition, can perform tolerably well, although improvement is needed. And the research is looking at the different types of insulation that's available. In a project in Glasgow, we tested 6 different types of insulation material on a project, a social housing project internally, internal insulation, and we're awaiting the results once the building is occupied to see how these different products handle moisture. And at the moment it's too early to say, because we've really just tested them for thermal efficiency only. Results have been very good, but we need a moisture load internally in the building itself so we can see how the different products handle the moisture and making sure that the wall is able to disperse the water vapour as it is required to do.
Why should we value our existing buildings?
The whole issue of the value of the existing and traditional and historic built environment can be looked at in two levels. You can apply it purely at a cultural level, i.e. the beauty and shape and proportion and texture of what we have, but also slightly more subtle reasons of human grain, human scale, its usability by people, established urban centres and conurbations that are based on essentially a pedestrian layout and function. And I think we know that that gives very strong links with identity, with attractiveness, with its desirability for visitors, and we mustn't forget Scotland's the importance of Scottish tourism and visitors who come to this country and look at it for its aesthetic qualities. But also the fact that the traditional environment is proven. A lot of these buildings have passed the 100-year test, possibly even the 200-year test, and in fact there is an ongoing value there of it's been built once. It doesn't need to be torn down and replaced because it's proved itself. So you can apply it at technical level, you can apply it at a cultural level, and also at the people using it and its desirability for people to work and live in.
Do you think that the traditionally built environment has a part to play in reducing carbon emissions? It would
be very, very wrong for us to say historic buildings, precious and pretty, leave them alone. Because at the moment about 2.5% of Scotland's buildings are listed and therefore have some degree of statutory protection. But I think it's important that we get all buildings of all types to perform. 20% of Scotland's housing stock is built pre-1919. That's a lot of buildings, and we're very, very keen that the methodologies we develop in this project and in other projects are able to address both the listed material, the listed housing stock, but most importantly the 20% of traditionally built buildings, most of which are pre-1919, but need to be looked after in a very, very similar fashion to the historic stuff. After all, they're built with the same palette of materials, similar trades and skills, similar materials and finishes, perhaps just a slight different level of cost spent on the structure. But no, we should feel that the traditionally built environment and the historic environment is part of the solution, not the problem.
What range of case studies have you got?
There are a couple of studies out now. BRE have published a report, and we've done an initial report on the refurbishment costs in carbon terms versus the demolition and rebuild. And certainly at a fairly basic level, our study showed that modest refurbishment paid itself back in carbon and in financial terms. It had a greater saving than demolition and replacement with a very, very energy efficient modern building, simply because of the taking into account the demolition costs, the landfill costs, the disposing of the material, and also the embodied carbon or the carbon cost that comes with new materials and modern materials. And let's not forget, quite a lot of modern materials that allow a building to have a very low operational energy in use, come with quite a long carbon tail, particularly if they've been imported. And the durability of these products need to be looked at. Can they be repaired? How easy it is to get replacement parts, or are we dependent on having to replace the whole unit when a single part of that product actually fails? So there are wider issues of durability and sustainability, not just the point in time of the energy required in use at that moment.